Life of Mine Part 35. I was convinced that there was no longer any chance of having Tristan produced at the opera, as I had found out that Frau Dustman's indisposition was merely a feint, her Anders' complete loss of voice having been the real cause of the last interruption. Good old conductor Esser tried hard to persuade me to assign the part of Tristan to another tenor of the theatre named Walter, but the very idea of him was so odious to me that I could not even bring myself to hear him in Lohengrin. I therefore let the matter sink into oblivion and concentrated myself exclusively on getting into touch with the Meistersinger again. I first set to work on the instrumentation of the completed portion of the first act, of which I had only arranged detached fragments as yet. But as summer approached, the old anxiety as to my future subsistence began to pervade all my thoughts and sensations in the present. It was clear that, if I were to fulfill all my responsibilities, particularly with regard to Minna, I should soon have to think of undertaking some lucrative enterprise again. It was therefore most opportune when a quite unexpected invitation from the management of the National Theatre in Budapest reached me to give 2 concerts there, in compliance with which I went at the end of July to the Hungarian capital and was received by the manager Radnod. There I met a really very talented violinist named Remenii, who at one time had been a protégé of Liszt, and showed boundless admiration for me, even declaring that the invitation to me had been given entirely on his initiative. Although there was no prospect of large earnings here, as I had professed myself content to accept 1,000 marks for each of the 2 concerts, I had reason to be pleased both with their success and with the great interest manifested by the audience. In this city, where the Magyar opposition to Austria was still at its strongest, I made the acquaintance of some exceedingly gifted and distinguished-looking young men, among them Hrasti, of whom I have a pleasant recollection. They organized a truly idyllic festivity for me, in the form of a feast, held by a few intimates on an island in the Danube, where we gathered under an ancient oak tree, as though for a patriarchal ceremony. A young lawyer, whose name I have unfortunately forgotten, had undertaken to propose the toast of the evening, and filled me with amazement and deep emotion, not only by the fire of his delivery, but also by the truly noble earnestness of his ideas, which he based upon a perfect knowledge of all my works and undertakings. We returned home down the Danube in the small boats of the rowing club, of which my hosts were members, and on our way had to face a hurricane, which lashed the mighty stream into the wildest tumult. There was only one lady in our party, Countess Bethlengabor, who was seated with me in a narrow boat. Hrasti and a friend of his who had the oars were concerned solely with the fear that our boat would be shivered against one of the timber rafts, towards which the flood was carrying us, and therefore exerted themselves to the utmost to avoid them, whereas I could see no other way of escape, especially for the lady sitting beside me, than by boarding one of these very rafts. In order to effect this, against the wish of our 2 oarsmen, I seized with one hand a projecting peg on a raft we were passing and held our little vessel fast, and, while the 2 rowers screamed that the Ellida would be lost, quickly hoisted the lady out of the skiff onto the raft, across which we walked to the shore, calmly leaving our friends to save the Ellida as best they could. We 2 then continued our way along the bank through a terrific storm of rain, but yet on safe and sure ground, towards the city. My conduct in presence of this danger did not fail to increase the respect in which my friends held me as was proved by a banquet given in a public garden at which a great number of my admirers were present. Here they treated me quite in Hungarian style. An enormous band of gypsy musicians was drawn up and greeted me with the Rakoczy march as I approached, while the assembled guests joined in with impetuous shouts of Elgin. There were also fiery orations with appreciative allusions to myself and my influence, which extended far and wide throughout Germany. The introductory parts of these speeches were always in Hungarian, and were meant to excuse the fact that the main oration would be delivered in German for the sake of their guest. Here I noticed that they never spoke of me as Richard Wagner, but as Wagner Richard. Even the highest military officials were not behindhand in offering me their homage through the medium of Field Marshal Coronini. The Count invited me to a performance by the military bands in the castle at Ofen, where I was graciously received by him and his family, treated to ices, and then conducted to a balcony whence I listened to a concert given by the massed bands. The effect of all these demonstrations was exceedingly refreshing, and I almost regretted having to leave the rejuvenating atmosphere of Budapest and return to my dull and musty Viennese asylum. On the homeward journey, in the beginning of August, I traveled part of the way with Herr von Seebach, the amiable Saxon ambassador, whom I had known in Paris. He complained of the enormous losses he had incurred through the difficulty of administering the South Russian estates he had acquired by marriage, and from which he was just returning. On the other hand, I was able to reassure him as to my own position, which seemed to give him genuine pleasure. The small receipts from my Budapest concerts, of which, moreover, I had only been able to carry away half, were not calculated to afford me any effectual relief as to the future. Having now staked my all on what I trusted might be a permanent establishment, the first question was how best to secure a salary which should at least be certain though not necessarily overlarge. Meanwhile, I did not consider myself bound to abandon my St. Petersburg connection, nor the plans I had founded upon it. Nor did I entirely disbelieve the assurances of Remenyi, who boasted that he had great influence with the Magyar magnates, and assured me it would be no great matter to obtain a pension in Budapest, such as I had thought of securing in St. Petersburg and involving similar obligations. He did, in fact, visit me soon after my return to Penzing, accompanied by his adopted son, young Plotinii, whose extraordinary good looks and amiability made a very favorable impression on me. As for the father himself, although he won my warm approbation by his brilliant performance of the Rakoczy march on the violin, yet I quickly perceived that his glowing promises had been meant rather to create an immediate impression on me than to ensure any permanent result. In accordance with his own desire, I very soon afterwards lost sight of him altogether. While still obliged to busy myself with plans for concert tours, I was able meantime to enjoy the pleasant shade of my garden during the intense heat, and I used to go for long rambles every evening with my faithful dog Pole, the most refreshing of these being by way of the dairy farm at St. Veit, where delicious milk was available. My small social circle was still restricted to Cornelius and Tausig, who was at last restored to health, although he disappeared from my sight for some time owing to his intercourse with wealthy Austrian officers. But I was frequently joined on my excursions by the younger Porges, and for a time by the elder also. My niece Ottilie Brockhaus, too, who was living with the family of her mother's friend Heinrich Lobby, occasionally delighted me with a visit. But whenever I settled down seriously to work, I was goaded afresh by an uneasy apprehension as to the means of subsistence, as another journey to Russia was out of the question until the following Easter. Only German towns could serve my purpose for the present. From many quarters, as for instance from Darmstadt, I received unfavorable replies, and from Karlsruhe, where I had applied direct to the Grand Duke, the answer was indefinite. But the severest blow to my confidence was a direct refusal which came in response to the application I had at last made to St. Petersburg, the acceptance of which would have ensured a regular salary. This time the excuse made was that the Polish Revolution of that summer had paralyzed the spirit of artistic enterprise. Pleasanter news, however, came from Moscow, where they held out prospects of some good concerts for the coming year. I next bethought me of a very sound suggestion about Kiev made to me by Setov the singer, who thought there was a prospect of a highly profitable engagement there. I entered into correspondence on the matter, and was again put off until the following Easter, when all the smaller Russian nobility congregated at Kiev. These were all plans for the future which, if I then had considered them in detail at that time, would have been enough to rob me of all peace of mind for my work. In any case, there was a long interval during which I must provide, not only for myself, but also for Minna. Any prospect of a position in Vienna had to be handled most warily, so that, with the approach of autumn, there was nothing left me but to raise money on loan, a business in which Tausig was able to help me, as he possessed extraordinary experience in such matters. I could not help wondering whether I should have to give up my Penzing establishment, but on the other hand, what alternative was open to me? Every time I was seized with the desire to compose, these cares obtruded themselves on my mind, until, seeing that it was only a question of putting things off from day to day, I was driven to take up the study of Dunker's Geschichte. In the end, my correspondence about concerts swallowed up the whole of my time. I first asked Heinrich Porges to see what he could arrange in Prague. He also held out a reasonable prospect of a concert at Lowenberg, relying upon the favorable disposition of the Prince of Hohenzollern, who lived there. I was also advised to apply to Hans von Bronsart, who at this time was conductor to a private orchestral society in Dresden. He responded loyally to my proposition, and between us we settled the date and program of a concert to be conducted by me in Dresden. As the Grand Duke of Baden had also placed his theatre at Karlsruhe at my disposal for a concert to be given in November, I thought I had now done enough in this direction to be entitled to take up something different. I therefore wrote a fairly long article for Ulfrabel's paper Der Botschafter on the Imperial Grand Opera House in Vienna, in which I made suggestions for a thorough reform of this very badly managed institution. The excellence of this article was at once acknowledged on all sides, even by the press, and I appear to have made some impression in the highest administrative circles, for I shortly afterwards heard from my friend Rudolf Lichtenstein that tentative advances had been made to him with a view to his accepting the position of manager, associated with which there was certainly an idea of asking me to become conductor of the Grand Opera. Among the reasons which caused this proposal to fall through was the fear, Lichtenstein informed me, that under his direction people would hear nothing but Wagner operas. In the end, it was a relief to escape from the anxieties of my position by starting on my concert tour. First I went to Prague in the beginning of November to try my luck again in the matter of big receipts. Unfortunately, Heinrich Porges had not been able to take the arrangements in hand this time, and his deputies, who were very busy schoolmasters, were not at all his equals for the task. Expenses were increased, while receipts diminished, for they had not ventured to ask such high prices as before. I wished to repair this deficiency by a second concert a few days later, and insisted on the point, although my friends urgently dissuaded me, and as the event proved, they were quite right. This time the receipts hardly covered the costs, and as I had been obliged to send away the proceeds of the first concert to redeem an old bill in Vienna, I had no other means of paying my hotel expenses and my fare home than by accepting the offer of a banker who posed as a patron to help me out of my embarrassment. In the chastened mood induced by these occurrences, I pursued my journey to Karlsruhe via Nuremberg and Stuttgart, under wretched conditions of severe cold and constant delays. At Karlsruhe I was at once surrounded by various friends who had come there on hearing of my project. Richard Pohl from Baden, who never failed me, Mathilde Meyer, Frau Betty Schott, the wife of my publisher, even Raff from Wiesbaden and Emily Jennist were there, as well as Karl Eckert, who had recently been appointed conductor at Stuttgart. Trouble began at once with a vocalist for my first concert, fixed for November 14th as the baritone Hauser, who was to sing Wotan's Farewell and Hans Sachs's Cobbler Song, was ill and had to be replaced by a voiceless though well-drilled vaudeville singer. In Edouard de Vriant's opinion, this made no difference. My relations with him were strictly official, but he certainly carried out my instructions for the arrangement of the orchestra very correctly. From an orchestral point of view, the concert went off so well that the Grand Duke, who received me very graciously in his box, desired a repetition in a week's time. To this proposal I raised serious objections, having learned by experience that the large attendances at such concerts, particularly at special prices, were mainly accounted for by the curiosity of the hearers, who often came from long distances, whereas the number of genuine students of art, whose interest was chiefly in the music, was but small. But the Grand Duke insisted, as he wished to give his mother-in-law, Queen Augusta, whose arrival was expected within a few days, the pleasure of hearing my production. I should have found it dreadfully wearisome to have to spend the intervening time in the solitude of my Karlsruhe hotel, but I received a kind invitation to Baden-Baden from Madame Kalergis, who had just become Madame Mukhanov, and had gone to live there. She had, to my delight, been one of those who came over for the concert, and was now on the station to meet me when I arrived. I felt I ought to decline her proffered escort into the town, not considering myself sufficiently smart in my brigand hat, but with the assurance, "We all wear these brigand hats here." She took my arm, and thus we reached Pauline Viardot's villa, where we were to dine, as my friend's own house was not yet quite ready. Seated by my old acquaintance, I was now introduced to the Russian poet Turgenev. Madame Mukhanov presented me to her husband with some hesitation, wondering what I should think of her marriage. Supported by her companions, who were all society people, she exerted herself to maintain a fairly lively conversation during the time we were together. Well satisfied by the admirable intention of my friend and benefactress, I again left Baden to fill up my time by a little trip to Zurich, where I again tried to get a few days' rest in the house of the Wesendonck family. The idea of assisting me did not seem even to dawn on these friends of mine, although I frankly informed them of my position. I therefore returned to Karlsruhe, where, on the 22nd of November, as I had foreseen, I gave my second concert to a poorly filled house. But in the opinion of the Grand Duke and his wife, Queen Augusta's appreciation should have dispelled any unpleasant impressions I might have received. I was again summoned to the royal box, where I found all the court gathered round the Queen, who wore a blue rose on her forehead as an ornament. The few complimentary observations she had to offer were listened to by the members of the court with breathless attention. But when the royal lady had made a few general remarks and was about to enter into details, she left all further demonstration to her daughter, who, as she said, knew more about it. The next day I received my share of the takings, half the net profits, which amounted to 200 marks, and with this I at once bought myself a fur coat. The sum asked for it was 220 marks, but when I explained that my receipts had only been 200 marks, I managed to get the extra 20 knocked off the price. There was still the Grand Duke's private gift, consisting of a gold snuff box with 15 louis d'or, for which I, of course, returned my thanks in writing. I next had to face the question whether, after the toilsome fatigue of the past weeks, I would add to my disappointments by attempting to give the proposed concert in Dresden. Many considerations, practically everything indeed that I had to weigh in connection with a visit to Dresden, moved me to have the courage to write and tell Hans von Bronsart at the last moment to cancel all arrangements and not expect me there, a decision which, although it must have caused him much inconvenience after all the preparations he had kindly made, he accepted with a very good grace. I still wanted to see what I could do with the firm of Schott, and travelled by night to Mayence, where Mathilde Meyer's family insisted on my spending the day at their little house, where I was entertained in a simple and friendly fashion. During the day and night I spent here in the narrow Karthausergasse, I was waited upon with the greatest care, and from this outpost I assaulted the publishing house of Schott, though without securing much booty. This was because I refused my consent to a separate issue of the various selections from my new works which had been picked out and prepared for concert use. As my only remaining source of profit now seemed to be the concert at Lohenberg, I turned my face thither. But in order to avoid passing Dresden, I made a short detour by way of Berlin, where, after traveling all night, I arrived, very tired, early on the 28th of November. In compliance with my request, the Bülows took me in, and at once began urging me to break my intended journey to Silesia by giving them a day in Berlin. Hans was particularly anxious for me to be present at a concert to be given that evening under his direction, a fact which finally decided me to remain. In defiance of the cold, raw and gloomy weather, we discussed as cheerfully as we could my unfortunate position. By way of increasing my capital, it was resolved to hand over the Grand Duke of Baden's gold snuff-box to our good old friend Weitzman for sale. The sum of 270 marks realized by this was brought to me at the Hotel Brandenburg, where I was dining with the Bülows, and was an addition to my reserves that furnished us with many a jest. As Bülow had to complete the preparations for his concert, I drove out alone with Cosima on the promenade as before in a fine carriage. This time all our jocularity died away into silence. We gazed speechless into each other's eyes. An intense longing for an avowal of the truth mastered us, and led to a confession which needed no words of the boundless unhappiness which oppressed us. The experience brought relief to us both, and the profound tranquillity which ensued enabled us to attend the concert in a cheerful, unembarrassed mood. I was actually able to fix my attention clearly on an exquisitely refined and elevated performance of Beethoven's smaller concert overture in C major, and likewise on Hans's very clever arrangement of Gluck's overture to Paris and Helen. We noticed Alwine Frumman in the audience, and during the interval met her on the grand staircase of the concert hall. After the second part had begun, and the stairs were empty, we sat for some time on one of the steps chatting gaily with our old friend. After the concert we were due at my friend Weitzman's for supper, the length and abundance of which reduced us, whose hearts yearned for profound peace, to almost frantic despair. But the day came to an end at last, and after a night spent under Bülow's roof, I continued my journey. Our farewell reminded me so vividly of that first exquisitely pathetic parting from Cosima at Zurich, that all the intervening years vanish like a dream of desolation separating 2 days of lifelong moment and decision. If on the first occasion our presentiment of something mysterious and inexplicable had compelled silence, it was now no less impossible to give words to that which we silently acknowledged. I was met at one of the stations in Silesia by conductor Seefriz, who accompanied me in one of the prince's carriages to Lohenberg. The old Prince of Hohenzollern-Hechingen was already very well disposed towards me on account of his great friendship for Liszt, and had, moreover, been fully informed of my position by Heinrich Porges, who had been engaged by him for a short time. He had invited me to give a concert in his small castle to an audience composed exclusively of invited guests. I was very comfortably accommodated in apartments on the ground floor of his house, whither he frequently came on his wheeled chair from his own rooms directly opposite. Here I could not only feel at ease, but be to some extent hopeful. I at once began rehearsing the pieces I had chosen from my operas with the prince's by no means ill-equipped private orchestra, during which my host was invariably present and seemed well satisfied. Meals were all taken very sociably in common, but on the day of the concert there was a kind of gala dinner, at which I was astonished to meet Henriette von Bissing, the sister of Madame Will of Marienbad, with whom I had been intimate at Zurich. As she had an estate near Lohenberg, she had also been invited by the prince, and now gave me proof of her faithful and enthusiastic devotion. Being both intelligent and witty, she at once became my favorite companion. After the concert had passed off with reasonable success, I had to fulfill another wish of the prince's next day, by privately playing to him Beethoven's symphony in C minor, when Frau von Bissing was also present. She had now been for some time a widow. She promised to come to Breslau, when I gave my concert there. Before my departure, conductor Seefriz brought me a fee of 4,200 marks from the prince, with an expression of regret that for the present it was impossible for him to be more liberal. After all my previous experiences, I was truly astonished and contented, and it was with pleasure I returned the gallant prince my heartfelt thanks with all the eloquence at my command. Thence I travelled to Breslau, where the concert director, Damrosch, had arranged a concert for me. I had made his acquaintance on my last visit to Weimar, and had also heard of him through Liszt. Unfortunately, the conditions here struck me as extraordinarily dismal and desperate. The whole affair had been planned on the meanest scale, as indeed I might have expected. A perfectly horrible concert room, which usually served as a beer restaurant, had been engaged. At the rear of this, and separated from it by a dreadfully vulgar curtain, was a small Tivoli theatre, for which I was obliged to procure an elevated plank floor for the orchestra, and the whole concern so disgusted me that my first impulse was to dismiss the seedy-looking musicians on the spot. My friend Damrosch, who was very much upset, had to promise me that at least he would have the horrible reek of tobacco in the place neutralized, as he could offer no guarantee as to the amount of the receipts. I was only induced in the end to go on with the enterprise by my desire not to compromise him too severely. To my amazement, I found almost the entire room, at all events the front seats, filled with Jews, and in fact I owed such success as I obtained to the interest excited in this section of the population, as I learned the next day, when I attended a midday dinner arranged in my honor by Damrosch, at which again only Jews were present. It was like a ray of light from a better world when, on leaving the concert hall, I perceived Fräulein Marie von Buck, who had hurried hither with her grandmother from the Hatzfeld estate to be present at my concert, and was waiting in a boarded compartment dignified by the name of box, for me to come out after the audience had left. The young lady came up to me once more in traveling costume after Damrosch's dinner, and attempted by kindly and sympathetic assurances somewhat to assuage my evident anxiety respecting the future. I thanked her once more by letter for her sympathy after my return to Vienna, to which she replied by a request for a contribution to her album, in memory of the emotions which had convulsed me on leaving Berlin, and also as an indication of my mental mood to one worthy of the confidence. I added Calderon's words, things impossible to conceal, yet impossible of utterance. By this I felt I had conveyed to a kindly disposed person, though with a happy vagueness, some idea of the secret knowledge which was my sole inspiration. But the results of my meeting with Henriette von Bissing in Breslau were very different. She had followed me thither, and put up at the same hotel. Influenced, no doubt, by my sickly appearance, she seemed to give her sympathy for myself and my situation full play. I placed the latter before her without reserve, telling her how, ever since the upset following on my departure from Zurich in 1858, I had been unable to secure the regular income necessary for the steady pursuit of my calling, and also of my invariably vain attempts to bring my affairs into any settled and definite order. My friend did not shrink from attributing some blame to the relationship between Frau Wesendonck and my wife, and declared that she felt it her mission to conciliate them. She approved my settling down at Penzing, and only hoped that I might not spoil its beneficial effect upon me by distant enterprises. She would not listen to my plan of touring in Russia in the coming winter, in order to earn money for my absolute necessities, and herself undertook to provide from her own very considerable fortune the not unimportant sum requisite to maintain me in independence for some time to come. But she explained to me that for a short while longer I was to try and get along through thick and thin, as she would have some difficulty, possibly a good deal, in placing the promised money at my disposal. Greatly cheered by the impressions of this meeting, I returned to Vienna on the December 9th. At Lowenberg I had been obliged to remit to Vienna the greater portion of the prince's gift, part of it for Minna, and part for the payment of debts. Though I had but little cash, I felt thoroughly sanguine. I could now greet my few friends with tolerable good humor, and among them Peter Cornelius, who looked in on me every evening. As Heinrich Porges and Gustav Skonek sometimes joined us, we founded an intimate little circle and met regularly. On Christmas Eve I invited them all to my house, where I had the Christmas tree lighted up, and gave each one an appropriate trifle. Some work also came my way again, for Tausig asked me to help him with a concert which he was to give in the Great Redundansaal. In addition to a few selections from my new operas, I also conducted the Freistaats Overture for my own particular satisfaction and entirely according to my own interpretation. Its effect, even upon the orchestra, was truly startling. But there did not seem the slightest prospect of any official recognition of my abilities. I was, and continued to be, ignored by the great. Frau von Biasing's communications revealed by degrees the difficulties which she had encountered in the fulfillment of her promise, but as they were still hopeful in tone, I was able to spend New Year's Eve at the Standhartners in good spirits, and to enjoy a poem specially written by Cornelius for the occasion, which was as humorous as it was solemnly appropriate. The new year 1864 assumed for me an aspect of gravity which soon became intensified. I fell ill with a painful and increasing malady due to a chill, which often made demands on Standhartner's care. But I was yet more seriously threatened by the turn of Frau von Bissing's communications. It seemed she could only raise the promised money with the help of her family, the Slomans, who were shipowners in Hamburg, and from them she was meeting with violent opposition, mingled, as it seemed, with slanderous charges against me. These circumstances upset me so much that I wished I could renounce all help from this friend, and I began once more to turn my serious attention to Russia. Fräulein von Reden, to whom I again applied, felt she must vigorously dissuade me from any attempt to visit St. Petersburg, in the first place because, owing to the military disturbances in the Polish provinces, I should find the route blocked, and secondly because, roughly speaking, I should attract no notice in the Russian capital. On the other hand, a visit to Kiev, with a chance of 5,000 rubles profit, was represented as undoubtedly feasible. Keeping my thoughts fixed on this, I arranged with Cornelius, who was to accompany me, a plan for crossing the Black Sea to Odessa, and going from there to Kiev, with a view to which we both resolved to procure the indispensable fur coats at once. Meanwhile, the only course open to me was to see about raising money by fresh bills at short dates, wherewith to pay all my other bills, which were also short-dated. Thus I became launched upon a business system which, leading, as it did, to obvious and inevitable ruin, could only be finally resolved by the acceptance of prompt and effectual help. In these straits I was at last compelled to request a clear declaration from my friend, not as to whether she could help me at once, but whether she really wished to help me at all, as I could no longer stave off ruin. She must have been in the highest degree wounded by some notion or other, of which I was ignorant, before bringing herself to reply in the following tone. You wish to know finally whether I will or not? Well, then, in God's name, and no. Not long after this I received from her sister, Madame Will, a very surprising explanation of her conduct, which seemed at the time perfectly inexplicable, and only to be accounted for by the weakness of her not very reliable character. Amid all these vacillations the month of February had run to an end, and while Cornelius and I were busy on our Russian plans, I received news from Kiev and Odessa that it would be unwise to attempt any artistic enterprises there during the present year. By this time it had become clear that, under the conditions thus developed, I could no longer reckon on maintaining my position in Vienna or my establishment at Penzing. Not only did there seem no prospect of even a temporary nature of earning money, but my debts had mounted up, in the usual style of such usury, to so great a sum, and assumed so threatening an aspect that, failing some extraordinary relief, my very person was in danger. In this perplexity I addressed myself with perfect frankness at first only for advice to the judge of the Imperial Provincial Court, Edouard List, the youthful uncle of my old friend Franz. During my first stay in Vienna this man had shown himself a warmly devoted friend, always ready to help me. For the discharge of my bill debts he could naturally suggest no other method than the intervention of some wealthy patron who should settle with my creditors. For some time he believed that a certain Madame Scholler, the wife of a rich merchant and one of my admirers, not only possessed the means, but was willing to use them on my behalf. Standhartner also, with whom I made no pretense of secrecy, thought he could do something for me in this way. Thus my position was for some weeks again most uncertain, until at last it became clear that all my friends could procure me was the means for flight to Switzerland, which was now deemed absolutely necessary where, having saved my skin so far, I should have to raise money for my bills. To the lawyer, Edouard List, this way of escape seemed specially desirable, because he would then be in a position to punish the outrageous usury practiced against me. During the anxious time of the last few months, through which, nevertheless, there had run an undercurrent of indefinite hope, I had kept up a lively intercourse with my few friends. Cornelius turned up regularly every evening, and was joined by Bach, little Count Laurencin, and on one occasion by Rudolf Liechtenstein. With Cornelius alone I began reading the Iliad. When we reached the catalogue of ships I wished to skip it, but Peter protested, and offered to read it out himself, but whether we ever came to the end of it I forget. My reading by myself consisted of Chateaubriand's La Vie de Rance, which Tausig had brought me. Meanwhile, he himself vanished without leaving any trace, until after some time he reappeared engaged to a Hungarian pianist. During the whole of this time I was very ill and suffered exceedingly from a violent catarrh. The thought of death took such hold on me that I at last lost all desire to shake it off, and even set about bequeathing my books and manuscripts, of which a portion fell to the lot of Cornelius. I had taken the precaution some time before of commending into Standhartner's keeping my remaining and now, alas, exceedingly doubtful assets which were in the house at Penzing. As my friends were most positive in recommending preparation for immediate flight, I had written to Otto Wesendonck requesting to be taken into his house, as Switzerland was to be my destination. He refused point blank, and I could not resist sending him a reply to prove the injustice of this. The next thing was to make my absence from home a short one, and to count upon a speedy return. Standhartner made me go and dine at his house in his great anxiety to cover up my departure, and my servant Franz Mrazek brought my trunk there too. My farewell to Standhartner, his wife Anna, and the good dog Pole was very depressing. Standhartner's stepson Karl Skonek and Cornelius accompanied me to the station, the one in grief and tears, the other inclining to a frivolous mood. It was on the afternoon of March 23rd that I left for Munich, my first stopping place, where I hoped to rest for 2 days after the terrible disturbances I had gone through, without attracting any notice. I stayed at the Bayerischer Hof, and took a few walks through the city at my leisure. It was Good Friday, and the weather was bitterly cold. The mood proper to the day seemed to possess the whole population. whom I saw going from one church to another dressed in deepest mourning. King Maximilian II, of whom the Bavarians had become so fond, had died a few days before, leaving as heir to the throne a son aged 18 and a half, whose extreme youth was no bar to his accession. I saw a portrait of the young King Ludwig II in a shop window, and experienced the peculiar emotion which is aroused by the sight of youth and beauty placed in a position presumed to be unusually trying. After writing a humorous epitaph for myself, I crossed Lake Constance unmolested and reached Zurich once more a refugee in need of an asylum, where I at once betook myself to Dr. Will's estate at Mariafeld. I had already written to my friend's wife to ask her to put me up for a few days, which she very kindly agreed to do. I had got to know her very well during my last stay at Zurich, while my friendship with him had somewhat cooled. I wanted to have time to find what seemed suitable quarters in one of the places bordering on Lake Zurich. Dr. Will himself was not there, as he had gone to Constantinople on a pleasure trip. I had no difficulty in making my friend understand my situation, which I found her most willing to relieve. First of all, she cleared 1 or 2 living rooms in Frau von Bissing's old house next door, from which, however, the fairly comfortable furniture had been removed. I wanted to cater for myself, but had to yield to her request to take over that responsibility. Only furniture was lacking, and for this she ventured to apply to Frau Wesendonck, who immediately sent all she could spare of her household goods, as well as a cottage piano. The good woman was also anxious that I should visit my old friends at Zurich to avoid any appearance of unpleasantness, but I was prevented from doing so by serious indisposition, which was increased by the badly heated rooms, and finally Otto and Mathilde Wesendonck came over to us at Mariafeld. The very uncertain and strained attitude apparent in these two was not entirely incomprehensible to me, but I behaved as if I did not notice it. My cold, which rendered me incapable of looking about for a house in the neighboring districts, was continually aggravated by the bad weather and my own deep depression. I spent these dreadful days sitting huddled in my Karlsruhe fur coat from morning till night, and addled my brain with reading one after another of the volumes which Madame will send me in my seclusion. I read Jean Paul's Siebenke's, Frederick the Great's Tagebuch, Tauzer, George Sand's novels and Walter Scott's, and finally Felicitas, a work from my sympathetic hostess's own pen. Nothing reached me from the outside world except a passionate lament from Mathilde Meyer, and a most pleasant surprise in the shape of royalties, 75 francs, which Truinet sent from Paris. This led to a conversation with Madame Will, half in anger and half with condemned self-cynicism, as to what I could do to obtain complete release from my wretched situation. Among other things, we touched upon the necessity of obtaining a divorce from my wife in order to contract a rich marriage. As everything seemed right, and nothing inexpedient in my eyes, I actually wrote and asked my sister Louise Brockhaus whether she could not, by talking sensibly to Minna, persuade her to depend on her settled yearly allowance without making any claims on my person in future. In reply, I received a deeply pathetic letter advising me first to think of establishing my reputation and to create for myself an unassailable position by some new work. In this way I might very probably reap some benefit without taking any foolish step, and in any case I should do well to apply for the post of conductor which was now vacant in Darmstadt. I had very bad news from Vienna. Standhardenker, to make sure of the furniture I had left in the house, sold it to a Viennese agent, with the option of repurchase. I wrote back in great indignation, particularly as I realized the prejudicial effect of this on my landlord, to whom I had to pay rent within the next few days. Through Madame will I succeeded in getting placed at my disposal the money required for the rent, which I forwarded at once to Baron Reykowitz. Unfortunately, however, I found that Standhartner had already cleared up everything with Edouard List, paying the rent with the proceeds from the furniture, and thereby cutting off my return to Vienna, which they both considered would be positive ruin to me. But when I heard at the same time from Cornelius that Tausig, who was then in Hungary, and who had added his signature to one of the bills of exchange, felt himself prevented by me from returning to Vienna as he desired, I was so sensibly wounded that I decided to go back on the spot, however great the danger might be. I announced my intention to my friends there immediately, but decided first to try and provide myself with enough money to be in a position to suggest a composition with my creditors. To this end I had written most urgently to Schott Mayence, and did not refrain from reproaching him bitterly for his behavior to me. I now decided to leave Mariafeld for Stuttgart to await the result of these efforts, and to prosecute them from a nearer vantage ground. But I was also, as will be seen, moved to carry out this change by other motives.